So welcome back to the next video on Regents Part 2, Short Essay Question 1, the second part of Short Essay Question 1. Fun fact, they're not questions. They're not asking you a question. They're giving you a command and they're telling you, hey, do this. So what you need to know about the second part of SEQ 1 is this. You need to identify one of these three relationships in the documents, okay? Cause and effect, this caused this. This led to this. Don't let your reader guess what you're doing. Your first sentence should really be plain and simple and sweet. There's a cause and effect relationship. Or document 1 caused document 2. Okay? Or the idea in document 1 caused the idea in document 2. Or influenced, right? Okay, there you go. Same thing with similarity or difference. How are these documents the same? How are these ideas the same? And what's different? How is it different? Big difference, small difference. Again, you want to start by identifying it very simply. These documents are similar, but they have some differences. These documents are more different than alike. Okay? Just lay it out on the table. Do not give your reader the grief of going back and having to diagnose what relationship you were writing about. They won't give you full credit because you didn't clearly explain it if they have to guess what relationship it was. And turning point. Turning point is a major idea, okay? Like the Declaration of Independence and equal rights and natural rights in a government. Or a turning point could be a part of history that was never the same again, like the invention of the internet. Or the American Civil War. They don't need to be good turning points. Turning points do not need to be for forever, okay? Like Plessy versus Ferguson in the establishment of Jim Crow segregation is a turning point for sure, but it wasn't forever. Turning points don't need to be forever, right? Reconstruction was a turning point, but it wasn't forever. We'll have a short video on like each of these. But what you need to know for the second part is, yes, as I've clearly stated, start by identifying the relationship, okay? Start by really super clearly identifying which one it was. But one thing you should know, super secret, but it's true, you can analyze more than one relationship, okay? Now, let's look at how to do this properly. A turning point can incorporate cause and effect, right? If you are looking at, we're still using this example, if you're looking at how George Washington's farewell address and the Monroe Doctrine were a turning point, you can talk about the effects. The effects of Washington's address was to influence future presidents in foreign policy, even up until World War II, where America wanted to stay isolated and out of it. That's great. You also can talk about the Monroe Doctrine, and this was so important that it influenced Teddy Roosevelt in America's foreign policy at the end of the 1800s. Great. The turning point can talk about the causes. What caused Monroe to issue this doctrine that became a turning point? Monroe's, one of the reasons for this turning point, one of the causes of this turning point, was the War of 1812 and nationalism that resulted. Okay, great. You can do that. Don't believe me? Come on. Well, let me just read it to you clear, because every year I have to read it to a teacher who's like, they can't use more than one relationship. Oh yeah, big guy, look at what it says in the scoring notes. You see, it says only one relationship needs to be discussed, aka you can get full credit for just doing similarities and differences. You can get full credit for just doing turning point or cause and effect. However, the response may refer to a second relationship as part of the discussion. So again, you do not want to just do 2 or never 3. Be like, here's the turning point, it's this. Here's the similarity, it's that. Here's the cause, it's the, okay, that's bad. And you won't get full points for that. But you can discuss something as part of another thing, right? Looking at similarities. Hey, this was a cause and effect relationship. Document A and George Washington's isolationist policy caused Monroe to be similarly okay, back up. George Washington's farewell address influenced future presidents such as James Monroe. It caused American presidents to be similarly isolationist in regards to Europe. And it caused similar statements like the Monroe Doctrine to not want America to have permanent entanglements with Europe. Okay? Or the effects. Hey, the effects of the Monroe Doctrine were very different than the effects of the farewell address, because many years later on, Teddy Roosevelt argued for a greater expansion of American involvement overseas, at least in the Western Hemisphere, based off of the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine caused the Roosevelt corollary to be different from Washington. So, like, you see what I'm doing here? I'm still living in causes and effects, but I'm using similarities and differences to analyze causes and effects. Above all else, last thing here for this video, do not just list the relationships. Do not say the cause was this, the effect was this, the turning point was this, the similarity is this, the difference is this. You might get no points, okay? You might literally get no points because not only did you not identify one, you didn't explain any of them, okay? So you need to identify and explain the relationship. Really briefly in the next video, we're gonna do it now. We're gonna do it right now. How do you do cause and effect? How do you do similarity and difference? And how do you do turning point? Let's do these briefly, although you just saw some wonderful examples, okay? How do you do cause and effect? Number one, are you looking at the events that caused other things? Or are you looking at ideas that cause things? Notice that these can switch. You can say, for example, events like the War of 1812 caused the ideas of nationalistic non-intervention in the Monroe Doctrine, okay? Or you could do it the other way. Hey, the ideas of George Washington's avoiding permanent entanglements, political entanglements, influenced the U.S. to try to avoid a war with Great Britain and France, but ultimately wasn't able to avoid the War of 1812, right? How did those ideas set up the events? You want to talk about cause and effect, and you want to know, and if you want to get a high score, that there are always multiple causes for any event in history. There are always multiple ideas, sometimes conflicting ideas, behind these events. If you look closely at this Monroe Doctrine, you should be like, what is he saying? We don't like colonialism, and we're not going to take kindly to Europe establishing new colonies, but we're not going to mess with anything they do in their existing colonies? Yeah, that is what is there. It would maybe be too aggressive to threaten European existing colonies, but it would maybe be neglectful of democracy and future allies if we just let European countries interfere with newly independent nations in Central and South America. Okay? Cause and effect. Multiple causes, and as you know, multiple effects. But you could also just focus on one and go into detail. For similarity and differences, I recommend a little bit of both, okay? I recommend talking about, again, hey, these events were similar because, but these events were different because. You want to show and explain their differences. You could explain why they're different or how they're similar. And again, you could lock in on similarities, you could lock in on differences. You could start by saying there are more differences than similarities because Washington is basically saying we're not going to get involved with European drama, and he doesn't mention anything about colonies at all. However, the biggest difference is that in the Monroe Doctrine, America is now, okay, you could focus on just the similarities or focus more on similarities or differences. And for the turning point should be a change that had a large impact, right? Why was Washington's isolationist stance in the farewell address something that people threw back to almost 120 years later, trying to avoid America's involvement in World War I? How did America utilize the Monroe Doctrine to grow its influence in the Western Hemisphere in terms of dollar diplomacy, big stick diplomacy, the war with Spain? Okay, turning points can certainly look at both short-term and long-term effects. It says may focus on immediate or long-term effects. Okay, but again, try to utilize outside information. So outside information is really very nice to incorporate in terms of the relationship for why things are similar or why a turning point lasted or came to an end. There we go. One video is better, I think, right? If you have questions, practice. Take a look at some of the examples that the Regents has given us in terms of these short essays. Remember, you want to do well on these short essay questions, but you don't want to take too much time. That's why it's good to be familiar with it before you get to the Regents exam. All right, reach out with any questions.